Welcome. We're very glad to see you here this morning. My name is Claire Sneed. I'm one of the Deputy Directors in the Office of Global Programs at DRL. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you some of my colleagues from the DRL Bureau and Friends of DRL. I'll start by introducing our panelists, and then each of them will speak for about 5 minutes about the work that their office does, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Sitting here on the end, we'll just move from right to left, or left to right. Charles Blaha from the Security and Human Rights Office. Next to him is Dan Nadel from the Office of International Religious Freedom. Sitting next to Dan is Lynn Sykade from the Bureau of Multilateral and Global Affairs. Next to Lynn is Steve Moody from the International Labor Affairs Office in DRL. And then on the end is Katrina Fodovat, who is with the Office of Global Women's Issues, GWE, who is also a former deputy in the GP office and has a long history working with this event and perhaps even initiating this annual gathering with our international or NGO partners. So we'll just move down the row, and then we'll open up to questions.
Okay, here's my mic. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cobb Blaha. I work for the Office of Security and Human Rights. I'm only going to talk very briefly because we want to spend as much time as possible with you, because this is really for you. I want to tell you first about the philosophy of my office, then I'll tell you what we do, and then I will tell you what types of programs could help us the most. The first thing you should notice about the name of our office is the name. It's not called Security or Human Rights. It's called Security and Human Rights. And the defining philosophy, the unified field theory of our office is that security and human rights are mutually reinforcing. People who put those on opposite ends, who say you have to balance, really miss the point, because one of the things we know, and it's supported by a growing body of research, is that governments and what we're interested in, security forces that respect human rights and that are accountable when they don't, are successful. Security forces that don't respect human rights actually complicate the problem, especially if you're talking about counterterrorism. If you're interested, there was a recent UNDP study that interviewed hundreds of people who had joined violent extremist organizations in Africa. 71% of those people said that the thing that pushed them over the tipping point was some abuse by security forces. So that's just one example. There are others. But that's just one example of why it's really important for security forces to be rights respecting and accountable. The thing that my office does that we're best known for, and that's probably our main focus of our activity, is we do Leahy vetting. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Leahy Law, probably many of you, but for those of you who haven't, the Leahy Law prohibits United States security assistance from going to units or individuals that have committed gross violations of human rights. My office is the chief implementing office in the State Department for that. In 2016, we processed 212,000 cases. This year, we'll do about 240,000. We also are responsible, working with the rest of our colleagues in the Human Rights Bureau, for human rights input into munitions licenses of all types, whether it's direct commercial sales, foreign military sales, foreign military financing, things like that. We're also responsible we're also the clearinghouse for the Child Soldiers Prevention Act, the listing and then later the waiver decisions or not about security assistance for countries that use child soldiers, and then finally we also are the bureau-wide clearinghouse for ideas about security force training. Here are the type of things we need, and a lot of times, and very later this afternoon I'm going to be going to a foreign embassy to explain the Leahy Law. Later this month I'll be going to a seminar with lots and lots of foreign military officers, and in compiling, in being able to vet cases under the Leahy Law, one of the things we rely on principally are reports from civil society, NGOs, and the media. And we get lots of complaints from governments and from other militaries and from police forces about the fact that we rely on reports from NGOs and the media. We do that because governments aren't very forthcoming often about their own abuses. But one of the ways that you can help us is through programs that train NGOs to produce fact-based, evidence-based, reliable, detail-oriented reports about abuses. Not just that somebody was tortured in X province, but the name of the person, the date, where, if possible, information about the units that are located there, information about whether there was any effort at accountability. Same thing for media. The other thing that would really help us is civil society that has the capacity to look with authority at security forces, that knows the structure, that knows the budgets, that knows the deployments, that knows the organizational details of security forces. This will help both in reporting, but also in oversight, especially when it comes to things like whether there's any accountability for abuses, how the budget is being spent, who's in charge of what unit. And then the final thing I say, and I think I'm probably at the end of my time, is programs. The other thing that would really help are programs aimed at standing up a core of academics or policymakers who can do some of these same things, but also provide governments with intelligent policy alternatives and policy recommendations for their security forces. So let me cede the floor here to Dan, but I'm ready to take your questions when we're all finished.
Good morning. My name is Dan Nadell, and I'm the director of the Office of International Religious Freedom within the DRL Bureau. The office was founded back in 1998. It was actually created by an act of Congress. And the one slightly unique feature about our office is, in addition to being a part of the DRL Bureau, we are headed by a senior official who does nothing but promote religious freedom around the world, and that's an ambassador at large for international religious freedom. That position has been vacant since January, but the president has nominated Kansas Governor Sam Brownback to that position. Governor Brownback had his confirmation hearing before the Senate several weeks ago. So in the relative near term, he may be coming to join us. So we're looking towards that. To give you a flavor of what our office is about, the reason that Congress created it in the first place was I think, based on a perception that religious freedom has been a key feature to the success of this country in the 250 or so years that we've existed. Many of the people who ended up on these shores were fleeing religiously motivated persecution at home. That was true in the 17th and 18th centuries. That continues to be true today in the 21st century. Religious freedom is found in our First Amendment, and when you look at the international standards, you can find language very similar to the language of our First Amendment in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and it's also Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Religious freedom is in short about the right of every single person to believe or not to believe, to change their beliefs, to speak about their beliefs to other people, to teach their beliefs to their children, to come together for worship or gathering with other people of similar beliefs. These are the rights that we're talking about. And one thing I would emphasize is these rights do not belong to groups. They belong to individuals as individuals. And individuals get to decide what group they want to affiliate with or not, what group they want to become a part of or leave. These are very fundamental human rights as individual rights in our system. So the basic premise of our office is we are working in partnership with our colleagues across the human rights apparatus of the State Department to advance respect for these particular sets of freedoms. And the freedoms that I mentioned simply can't exist without a whole bunch of supporting rights like freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression. So all of these form the core of what we're trying to achieve globally. we see ourselves as the primary point of contact between international civil society, domestic civil society organizations, and the State Department when it comes to matters of freedom of religion or belief. So organizations that have an interest in informing us of cases, of specific instances of abuse, so that we can kind of push that information through our system here. That's one reason folks would want to come and speak to us. Another reason is that, that organizations might have theories for change, ways that they believe we can better promote tolerance or mutual respect in countries where the situation between majority and minority communities is either tense or frankly downright violent. And looking at the state of the world, there's a lot of there's an increasing body of research. And the Pew Foundation recently found that some 80% of people around the world live in countries with either moderate or severe restrictions on religious freedom. And there is a strong correlation between countries that fail to respect religious freedom and issues of broader societal violence, governmental abuses, violent extremist organizations, and those organizations recruiting and finding people to join their ranks. As Cobb said, this is a significant security concern. And then when you look at countries that actually get these rights effectively protected, which are not just the kind of Western democracies that one might immediately think about, but there are a number of countries across Latin America, across Africa, Southeast Asia, elsewhere in the world where governments are effectively protecting these rights. What you see is a very strong correlation between the success of those societies and the vindication of rights of minorities. The most economically vibrant, successful, stable countries in the world are countries that protect religious freedom. So essentially, when it comes to program activities, a lot of what we're looking at is getting at root causes of the problems. And those problems fall into a couple of different baskets. First is governments. What governments are doing or not doing that infringes on the ability of all of their citizens to believe or not to believe. These may be laws, these may be policies. What do the police raid places of worship? Are there laws that prohibit somebody from changing their faith? So getting at those types of structural limitations is an important aspect programmatically of what we're doing. And hopefully that's supporting policy work that we're doing to engage governments to address these concerns from the diplomatic channels. The other piece of this whole puzzle involves societal actors and societal action. Because, of course, while there are plenty of governments that are doing the wrong thing or that are restricting the ability of people to believe or not to believe, what you see in many, many places is societal hostility, particularly directed at members of minority communities. And those minority communities can vary dramatically from country to country. I mean, in Sri Lanka, it might be Christians and Hindus and Muslims. In Bangladesh, it might be Hindus and Buddhists and Christians. In Syria, it could be all of the above. People who are politically perceived to be in opposition to the ruling regime. So the context depends. It makes a whole lot of difference, and it really does vary from place to place. But what you find as a universal truth is that there is a lot of societal animus directed at people who are perceived not to be part of the majority, part of the mainstream. And so looking both policy-wise and programmatically at promoting tolerance, promoting mutual respect, getting at young people in societies where you see either deeply entrenched long-standing hostilities or, frankly, government policies that may create additional hostilities for people that maybe did not appear the case in a previous generation. The third feature, which I would just mention briefly, is the rise of non-state actors, organized terrorist movements that control large swaths of territory, like you've seen with Boko Haram in northern Africa, like you've seen with ISIS, the Taliban, and others. And these are some of the stickiest situations for us because oftentimes these are religiously motivated groups that are intent on forms of repression against all people who deviate from their ideologies. So the tools in the toolbox may be more limited beyond kind of the military tools of getting bad people out of places. But still figuring out ways to address the situation of religious minorities or people who deviate from violent extremist ideology in places where violent extremists have actually taken over is another feature of what we're trying to work on, what we're thinking about. So I'll stop there, but look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning. I'm Lynn Sykate. I'm the Director of the Office of Multilateral and Global Affairs in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. My office handles a very wide array of policy issues. So I'm going to describe all of them and then really bear down on disability rights, LGBT rights, and internet freedom. So my office is the policy lead on civil society, democracy, vulnerable groups, internet freedom, business and human rights at the United Nations, visa issuance and human rights, asylum, anti-corruption, I'm almost done, and global Magnitsky. Through all of those areas, we really try to focus in on the ability of civil society actors to affect change and advocate on their own behalf in their own countries, at the UN, and in multi-stakeholder and multinational venues. We also work through a number of multi-stakeholder, multilateral, and multinational venues. That's, again, a long alphabet list. You probably know some of them: the Freedom Online Coalition, the Open Government Partnership, I did say the United Nations, the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, which is a business and human rights multi-stakeholder initiative, ICOCA, which deals with the hiring of security professionals. I know there are some others that I'm missing, but you probably know what they are. To gear down a little bit more, we've also led in the UN on the issues of freedom of association and assembly, freedom of expression, and we have had strong support for human rights defenders. There, for example, we know a number of people want to come to the UN to tell their stories and convince people of what's happening in their countries, which is harder than it sounds when you're sitting in front of a group of countries, not all of whom respect human rights, not all of whom believe in fundamental freedoms. In cases where individuals are being shut down in the UN, we try to stand up for them, try to make sure that they're heard. We work with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights if folks have been abused on their way home, to try to make sure that there's some way to deal with that particular situation. So we work with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We interact with special rapporteurs of the UN when it's appropriate to talk to them about various issues that are confronting people. More specifically, on disability rights, we work for inclusion of disability rights in key foreign policy areas. Those include worker rights, religious freedom, child labor, gender-based violence, the human rights of LGBTI individuals, trafficking in persons, and refugees. We also work to integrate disability rights within diplomacy that we're doing. So the best examples of those of late would be the APEC Group of Friends on Disability, where we've been quite active, and the U.S.-China Coordination Meeting on Disability Rights. On the human rights of LGBTI persons, our first and foremost goal is to address violence and reduce violence and discrimination. So we prioritize targeted violence against the LGBTI community in contexts like Chechnya in particular, and we're tracking very closely and concerned right now about the arrests and detentions that we see in Egypt, Azerbaijan, and Indonesia. In this respect, we deploy a variety of tools. We work with civil society primarily on LGBTI issues, so that we make sure that whatever we're doing in country, whether it's public diplomacy or private diplomacy, various other kinds of pressure the U.S. can bring to bear, that it's in line with what people on the ground are wanting us to do, and that it is, first and foremost, not harming their efforts in any way. LGBTI, in this respect, is probably amongst one of the most sensitive issues that we deal with in the department. And so we have, first and foremost, as a principle, to do no harm to people on the ground through the various diplomatic activities that we're pursuing. We are also very cognizant of the diversity in the community, and in particular, try to pay close attention to the needs of the transgender community and to the needs of lesbian women, which are sometimes, somewhat different than the G and the B. On internet freedom. In internet freedom, we're guided by the principle that people have the same rights online as they have offline. We work to ensure that the internet remains open, interoperable, and secure as a platform. And it's a platform on which people can continue to innovate, to organize, to express themselves, and to be free from undue interference and censorship. So our policy is to try to build international consensus around the importance of promoting and protecting human rights online. For that, we use the United Nations primarily and the Freedom Online Coalition and a number of bilateral engagements. We are also very concerned about digital safety and policy advocacy and technology and applied research, all of which help the global internet users overcome barriers to access in an open internet. We support the free flow of information online for a number of reasons, some of which have to do with enhancing trade and economic prosperity, but mostly because of our promotion of freedom of expression and freedom of association, freedom of assembly. There are a number of programs that are connected with internet freedom having to do with helping people have access and helping people understand what digital safety is. I could go on a lot longer with the topics that my office has, but I'm not going to. I'd pass it to Steve Moody.
I was just going to say, I used to be in Lynn's office, and I currently have a mercifully smaller mandate for my office than Lynn does, and just listening to her reminds me of just how many things they're doing. First off, I want to say a thank you to GP for having us together. The GP office, I am convinced, and I think other people in DRL are convinced, does some of the most important work in this building. And as you may or may not hear today, often folks outside the building and in the wider community cannot hear about the extent of that work. But it's great to be kind of here talking to folks who are either interested in working with DRL or already are working with DRL. I've been in the Bureau coming up on a decade myself. Some of my other colleagues have been here longer than that. And I like to think that we are all doing this work because we do feel like it's very valuable, it's relevant, and regardless of who's in charge wherever, people need to be helped in the field. So thank you again for having me. My office is a smaller office. I did have a titular head, kind of like the Ambassador to Religious Freedom that Dan has. My titular head may not be coming back into position, so to speak. We used to have a special representative for international labor affairs who typically has come from the labor community. That person's probably not going to be with us moving forward. But we work on labor rights, and like I said, it's a lot simpler than what Lynn had outlined. And when we think about labor rights, we've talked about the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What are we talking about? We're talking about when we look at those documents, and I am really trying to dodge this light up there while I talk to you, I'm sorry. Freedom of assembly, freedom of association, right? Basically 50 years ago when the main architecture of human rights was put together in some of those documents, they talked about those freedoms along with some of the other ones that Dan mentioned. Those are kind of the bedrock of what we try and advance in our office. Within that, there are 4 or 5 kind of core ones, core areas in which we work, and actually the greater global labor community. You all are probably familiar with our human rights reports, which come out each year and are usually released, if we're on time, February or March. If you look at Section 7 of that report, you'll see 4 or 5 different areas. You will see collective bargaining and freedom of association. You will see compulsory labor, child labor, discrimination, and acceptable conditions of work. When the United States government and other governments talk about the work we do in this area, generally it's going to be in one of those 4 or 5 areas. Let me just talk about 4 or 5 of the places where we're doing some of our work that may be of interest to you, and obviously we can have more of a conversation moving forward. First and foremost is worker voice. One of the things working with Lynn in her office, and a lot of us who work on civil society have seen, and Freedom House has documented, last 12, 13 years around the world we have seen a constraining of the voice and the opportunity for expression for civil society actors, whether they're members of an organization or a union. One of the things that we do is we try and build capacity of unions and other associations so the workers in whatever country can assert their rights or even just be familiar with the basics of what they are entitled to assert and how to move that forward either with the government or with other stakeholders. So I'd say that's one of the primary ones. Migrant workers. I was just in Qatar and Bahrain last week, actually, on this issue, my first time in the Middle East. It was pretty fascinating. And part of the reason I was there is because, as folks know, there is a large corridor of labor that goes from South Central Asia up to the Gulf, and we're increasingly seeing it also from Africa to that region of the world. I think there is a growing recognition about migration writ large that policymakers have a lot that they need to be responsible for. And one of the things that our office tries to engage in is work with civil society and also governments to make sure that these workers, even if they are migrant laborers, are fully entitled to the freedoms that any other worker would be entitled to. And it was interesting, last week there was an article in the Washington Post about some of the MacArthur Genius Award winners. Some of you folks may have read about it. And they said the one theme that cut across all of it was global migration issues, right? So this is really, there are a lot of manifestations of this issue. But it was fascinating to talk to the Qataris and the Bahrainis about what their departments of labor are trying to do in this area. Trade, a pretty obvious one. You probably heard that we're in the middle of NAFTA negotiations right now. NAFTA, free trade agreements, generalized system of preferences. We work with other parts of the USG. We work with civil society to try and hold recipient countries or beneficiary countries accountable for the trade, for the labor provisions in those trade agreements. We are at a unique opportunity where some folks may know that the President Trump, in outlining his national security policy, almost explicitly says we'd like to see trade work better on behalf of the American worker. So there may be some opportunities to hold some countries more accountable to some of those provisions under the aegis of leveling things for the American worker and making sure that companies abroad or governments abroad can't cut corners. Just a few more things. Businesses. We also will work with Lynn's office a lot on issues related to business and human rights. Supply chain, the awareness of a supply chain has become a huge deal in the international conversation with business and labor rights. I think we're still wrestling with how we can get our arms around that, but that's definitely a place moving forward where I can see us do some more programming because it involves workers at different parts of the process, the responsibilities of business, and on the responsibilities of business with whom we work a lot. One of the promising things, and this is connected to the migrant laborers, has been that we've had some good conversations and good progress with business, realizing that in some of those migrant worker scenarios, they're realizing that they should not be saddling those workers with the costs that go with their visa fees and their interview fees. So once they arrive in Qatar or wherever else it is for destination country, they're basically indentured to that company. Two more things I would mention. The ILO. The ILO, to many people, even if they do labor rights, it can sometimes kind of be like, yeah, ILO, I know that thing's out there. What is it? It can kind of be a sleepy institution. Coming up on its 100th birthday in Geneva, we work with our Department of Labor colleagues and other folks in the community, going there several times a year, and it really kind of is an indicator of what are the current ongoing conversations in the international labor rights community. So the last few years, we've had long conversations on supply chain, this year on labor migration, and next year we'll be having one on gender. Last thing that I would just mention before I pass it to Kat is our office specifically tries to reach out and give resources to our folks at Post. You all have interacted with embassies around the world likely, or your colleagues have, and you know that every embassy looks different. You might have a whole bunch of folks, small number of folks. One of the things we really try and do are give resources to our folks at Post, and we do a training here at the Foreign Service Institute, and often we have NGO partners come in and talk about their viewpoint of things. That's it. Thanks, Kat.
Okay, can everyone hear me? All right, good morning. I'm so thrilled to see you all. Every time I come to a Bidders Conference or any conference where there's a bunch of human rights-oriented people, I feel like I'm with my people. So good to see you all. Sincere thanks to my DRL family, who I can't seem to escape, or I kind of drag myself back into. So thanks to Claire and Pat and the rest of the DRL GP family, especially Tambria Schroeder and Marissa Brescia, who killed themselves for this. So many thanks to them. And we look forward to working with you all in the future. So I'm Kat Fotovat. I am the Director of Global Programming for the Office of Global Women's Issues here at the State Department. Our office is charged with promoting gender equality and gender inclusion across the Department of State. We do this in various ways. In particular, we try to use our very small but mighty budget and team to make sure that your voices and the voices of women all over the world are included, throughout any kind of diplomatic engagement and throughout any foreign assistance programming. So we are, as you can tell, those people that are constantly in everyone's faces, making sure that the women's voices and the people on the ground are actually being heard. Again, we make sure that we use our very small budget to build the capacity of organizations and posts to empower women and girls all over the world. In addition to the programming outcomes, we're looking for lessons learned and how are those applied, not just within our program, but we share this information with international donors across the board. There have been a lot of both private sector, foundational, other governments that have really stepped up to step into the gender space, and we want to make sure that we're sharing those lessons learned across the board. We're making a lot of important progress. From our work boosting embassies' efforts on gender throughout the Full Participation Fund, which is an effort that we run, and promoting women's agency in conflict countries through our Global Women, Peace and Security Initiative and CVE efforts. Our enhanced efforts help to address GBV and meet the needs of adolescent girls and women. Our office these days has been utilized to strategically propel our work forward. So the awareness of the significant impact of gender inclusion in all areas, reaching every sector from the economy to security to stabilization and development. The world is realizing that change cannot happen without women and girls being included. Additionally, technology and new areas of innovation are something that we're looking at programmatically. Technology is opening new areas where women can engage safely and securely, both in the economy and throughout other political areas. So we want to make sure that we're building on those as well. We're looking for more innovative approaches, which includes not just looking at gender organizations. How can a legal organization have a gender lens on it? So making sure that those kind of scopes are brought in. So we're looking at things holistically. What impacts women and girls does not happen in a vacuum. This is an entire broad spectrum of issues. So we're making sure to address that in the smartest way to make sure that we bring together partnerships. So another area that our office is emphasizing is the aspect of bringing partnerships together. Having had an NGO myself, I know that forced marriages and working with other organizations is not always easy, but certainly a lot of lessons learned, and often we have found that those can be the most successful and sustainable organizations and sustainable projects. We've seen amazing things happen when people bring in different aspects and different organizations to bear to their work. I'm thinking in particular of a forensics organization that has done some amazing work bringing in gender organizations to their work as well. And so we have seen, and our office is focusing on making sure that the private sector is pulled in. We work on 4 major areas. So the areas of concentration for our office are women, peace, and security, including countering violent extremism, adolescent girls, particularly focusing on areas where there are gaps that are not being addressed for girls. So we're looking at the whole of life for women and girls, but in particular, what we found is that the area of adolescence is someplace that is not being addressed. We also look at women's economic and political empowerment. The administration has been very, very forthcoming in terms of the emphasis on women's economic empowerment. So the area that we're focusing on in women's economic empowerment, again, is very broad. And how do all these aspects all feed into that? The emphasis there is also making the business case to companies, to countries, to make them understand without women's participation, your economies cannot grow. That there is a vast area of constituency and beneficiaries that you can look to have as new individuals for your businesses. So how this can exponentially increase your GDP. The global GDP would be increased something, they said, about $4 trillion if women were fully participating in them. So we try to make these cases as well and make sure that, that those cases are actually what's behavioral change is actually taking place. The other area that we concentrate on is preventing and countering gender-based violence. And that includes everything from early forced marriage to female genital mutilation, getting into the issues having to do with societal change and looking at networks. And one of the areas that we've noticed in any country, a lot of closed spaces, is that women's organizations have been very good at networking. They're very good at discussing things, coming together. We're trying to utilize that movement across the board and make sure that they also can communicate regionally, that they can communicate globally, and that they can include other marginalized populations as well and share their experiences and their strengths. And so we're trying to make sure to capitalize that and build upon that going forward. I won't talk too much longer, but so we're looking also at making sure that our international donors and that we have a whole of government approach. So we work with DOD, we work with USAID, obviously we work very closely with DRL, and so we make sure that we are coordinating these efforts as much as possible. I also wanted to point out we are taking a very consultative approach in how we are doing our programming, so we want to hear from activists, from women on the ground, from the beneficiaries that we're hoping to reach. We are actually putting together a listening session coming up on October 25th, and there are flyers out there if anybody would like to participate. They will be thematically focused sessions that we'd like to hear, again, not just from gender organizations, but they will be broken up into gender-based violence, women's economic empowerment, women, peace and security, and making sure, and adolescent girls. So we want to hear from you. We actually want you to give us feedback on how those programs and how our solicitations work. We want to hear what, again, we don't know everything. So we want to make sure that we are being responsive to you. From anything from M&E, we don't take M&E to be for just the donor. M&E needs to be for the organization. How are you utilizing M&E to make sure that that M&E is being fed back into your own organization and your constituencies and your beneficiaries? Anything from financial management. Financial management, again, is about you working in closed societies and protecting you. So whatever we can do to make sure those resources come to bear for you and that we are giving you the tools that you need. So these are the kind of things that we want to hear from you, as well as awareness of the issues on the ground. So there's flyers out there if anybody would like to participate. It's on October 25th, and please give us feedback. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for all your efforts. You really are our heroes. I hope you hear this every day. I am sometimes jealous of the implementers because I'm like, I want to do that. So please know that anything that you want to share with us, we are happy to hear. And thanks to DRL.
Thank you. We'd like to invite you to ask questions. As you know, the mics are on either far side of the auditorium. You can line up. And please introduce yourself or your organization.
Hi, Jessie again from the Honda Center at Stanford. Thank you all for your remarks. My question comes off of both Cobb and Kat's points about data and M&E. I'm wondering if anyone can offer some insight into how DRL might be thinking about supporting enhanced data collection capacities amongst human rights NGOs. Some research I've been doing in Southeast Asia really points to sort of a lack of tapping to local resources in a lot of these areas because obviously NGOs can't always pay these folks that well, and so anyone who does have sort of a lot of experience in good data analysis is going to other firms. So I'm just wondering, I know you've historically supported things like Martis and such technology, what you might be thinking about in terms of enhanced data collection right now. Thanks.
You want?
I'll tell you from the gender perspective. There's so little information out there from everything from GBV to women's economic empowerment. So within the programs that we're looking at, for example, we have a partnership with Kiva, and there is a public funding platform within that, and it's very localized in how some of these micro grants go out. But as we are doing any kind of microloans or anything of that nature, we are gathering information at the same time. Our hope is to make as much information public as possible. I say that with the caveat of often where we work and issues that we work on are very sensitive. So to the extent that we can protect people's privacy, not victimize anyone, we want to make sure that this is a discussion that happens broader and that we're again looking at things from a more thematic analytical perspective. So all of our projects are intended to bring in that information and to then feed that back out.
I can say from MLGA's perspective, data particularly on individuals with disabilities and the LGBTI community can be extremely hard to come by. I mean, these are probably some of the most hidden populations within several different kinds of countries. So we would actually appreciate a data approach and as much data as we could get with the same caveats that Kat has.
Let me offer a slightly different perspective on M&E. I mentioned in my presentation that one of the things that we do is the Office of Security and Human Rights is we offer a human rights perspective on Department of Defense training for foreign military forces. Under the new NDA, the National Defense Authorization Act for 2017, the Defense Department is charged with improving their measurement and evaluation of their training programs, and specifically of their human rights training programs. And there are DoD organizations and lots of other ones out there doing human rights trainings of security forces. If you ask them, how are we doing on human rights training, they will say, great. Here's how many people we trained last year. There is no M&E that we can find of what types of training is effective or not. We have no M&E. It's very difficult. I haven't been able, since I've been in my office, to find out, to track what happens to units of foreign police, of foreign military, of foreign counterterrorism forces. What happens to them after they get training? And the types of things that would be helpful to us is to have a longitudinal study of the numbers of human rights, the allegations of human rights violations against security forces over time. That would be very helpful. Also, whether anybody's being tried for any of these. Those types of things would be helpful. The other things that are helpful are some tracking of the attitudes of local populations towards security forces, because one of the things we know, one of the things I said when I first spoke, is that security forces that respect human rights and are accountable are successful. Well, the reasons they're successful is because they win the confidence of the population, right? That's how you counter violent extremism from a security point of view. That's how you counter insurgencies. That's how you fight organized crime, transnational crime. So to the extent that we had those types of data, that would be incredibly helpful to us. Maybe some of that is out there in some countries, but we haven't been able to find anybody who's doing it on a regularized or exhaustive basis. And so that would, what I would suggest is looking at units in countries that have received U.S. training and being able to trace their human rights history. That'd be very helpful.
Great. Next question.
I'm Hamid Behraoun with Democracy Council. Could you please talk about whether there is any interest to target a much younger demographics when it comes to some of the human rights challenges that require bottom-up solutions? Very specifically, when you have to build tolerance in the society on religious freedom or LGBTI issues or women's rights, you need to start from a young age and have much longer programs. We see that missing in most of the solicitations that we actually target.
I can start. Certainly I think for the kind of work that we're trying to do to build mutual respect and tolerance, a lot of that work is generational. And you really do have to start with younger generations. I know on the religious freedom front, we have solicitations periodically for things like curriculum development, curriculum focused on particularly, promoting visions of more tolerant, more inclusive societies. We do other youth-focused work, getting young people across religious, ethnic, ethno-linguistic lines to come together to see that members of minorities can be partners in trying to build the exact same kind of society that members of the majority community want to build. So for us, certainly, looking at the younger demographics and figuring out where they are, getting at them before they become the next generation of government leaders is absolutely critical, and actually changing the dynamics of that society towards a more tolerant approach. So yes, I think I can't speak for the other baskets, but certainly youth plays a very large role in the types of program work that we would do on the religious freedom side.
Yes, on LGBTI, I can say that there is some youth programming. It's primarily done, I believe, from USAID, but I believe that we do have a couple of programs ourselves. For my office, focused on the policy work, one of the things that we look to do on LGBTI, first and foremost, is deal with violence and deal with laws that outlaw people at the outset. 76 countries have such laws. That for us, from the policy perspective, this is the first thing that we need to try to tackle and change.
And I would say from the gender person, that's a great question. We actually target youth quite frequently, and making sure that, again, targeting adolescent girls is not just enough. Men and boys have to be brought into it. We're talking about societal change. You're talking about making sure movements are built, and that cannot happen without men and boys being engaged. And we're targeting boys at a very young age to understand cycles of violence and making sure that they are inclusive and making sure that women are supported and girls are supported, and talking about things in a different dynamic starts at a very young age. So your point is well taken, and something that we tried to make sure is considered within all of our proposals as well.
And just to reiterate, in the last session, it was, I think Pat mentioned that many of our proposals across all of these different themes have sort of a youth or vulnerable population or most vulnerable population target or component to them. So even if youth isn't explicitly the focus of the request for proposals, youth as a critical vulnerable population within those contexts is something that can be brought out in your applications. Sir.
Florindo Chivokut from Friends of Angola. I'm just a little bit concerned about the data on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, or human rights overall, even democracy. There's a sharp decline of those values throughout the world. I cannot speak for the entire world, but I can only speak where I come from, Angola, or maybe for the entire continent, because I do speak with a number of activists, human rights activists, and NGO workers as well within the continent. So it seems to me, and please, I hope I'm wrong, there's this perception that the new administration trying to embrace more the Chinese approach is we're going to do business as usual, but I mean, we want to ask questions about human rights issue. So if that's the case, then there might be really, we're in trouble, I think. And I mean, what else can we do, I mean, to reverse this trend? The Freedom House data is very clear when it comes to the decline of those basic values. I was just wondering if you could clarify some of those concerns that we have. Thank you.
Sure, you're right. There is a trend, of course. We are trying to combat those headwinds in a number of ways by supporting civil society. I do want to address the issue of perceptions of this administration. So my office also does the Community of Democracies, and we just had a ministerial in which the secretary spoke about the importance of democracy promotion, how it is tied integrally to U.S. foreign policy and to American values going forward. So I think there's a lot of chaff out there about what this administration is or isn't going to do, what they're going to say or not going to say, but it's a lot of chaff. And if you take a look at what our position has been with respect to Venezuela, it's very clear that we still have a strong human rights message. If you take a look at what we have been doing at the Human Rights Council, and I would encourage you to actually look at what U.S. interventions have been, you'll find that we haven't changed how we're talking about human rights. We haven't changed how we're talking about civil society. We haven't changed how we're talking about democracy. So, and the administration, you know, is still getting a little bit of its feet under the ground. We still don't have an assistant secretary in DRL, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to the chaff that you're seeing out there and the, you know, this administration is going to do horrible things, and I just don't see that happening, at least not from our level in MLGA.
What I would say with regard to what my office does, so I said that we're the implementer, the Chief State Department implementer for the Leahy Law, and it's the law. So, and it has very strong support on both sides of the aisle. The Leahy Law will not change. That is my prediction. And we will still be prohibited from giving assistance to security forces, counterterrorism forces, military police who commit gross violations of human rights. And we still need your help. We need responsible civil society organizations out there taking complaints and documenting abuses in an organized fashion. We need good independent journalists. We need civil society that understands the structure and the function and the personnel of the military, the police forces, and the counterterrorism forces so they can provide effective oversight and effective reporting. And I predict that will not change. So my message to you is be of good cheer and go about your work and do the types of things that will help civil society be an effective counterweight to these security forces that are so powerful in so many parts of the world.
I was just going to add two things. To echo what Lynn said, I was at the International Labor Organization International Labor Conference in June, where we had a bunch of country-specific engagements. And talking to my colleague who'd been doing this for a long time, there really was little, if no difference at all, about the things that we were highlighting in our engagements about Cambodia, Bangladesh, Azerbaijan, lack of freedoms in those countries, and speaking out on those things. And the other thing I would just return to is one can never predict the future, but the Human Rights Report has been with us for a long time, and I expect it to continue to be with us for a long time. And we know that a lot of the strength of that is not only how we use that at posts and engaging with the governments, but the strength of that Human Rights Report itself is often on the backs of the work that civil society folks like yourselves are doing in those countries and getting us some of this data that has been discussed. So in addition to along with the Be of Good Cheer, I would just say that is going to continue to be a tool that I know we're going to depend on and that we are going to use diplomatically moving forward.
Questions? I think we're on this side.
Good morning. Camille Jagana-Siegel from Financial Services Volunteer Corps. Pretty much all of you mentioned working with CSOs, and I was wondering if you're planning on doing any work with CSOs on budget monitoring and budget advocacy with governments, and if so, which one of your bureaus would be more likely to do such work?
It's my colleague here whispering to me, it's got to be you since it's none of us. To the extent that we do any of that, it's really through OGP work that we're doing and work with a support unit in the countries that submit themselves for peer review. I suspect that we may have programs to that extent, but I don't know, to be honest. Maybe Claire does.
Sorry.
I can say from the gender perspective, we would be looking at the role of women in government who might have influence over budgets and how that is impacting those budgets and where those are going. So we do have some programs that focus on that in the more the political participation realm.
I would just add, I can't answer your question specifically. I don't think we have or do, Pat.
Not specific on budget monitoring.
Not on budget monitoring, but our programs generally in sort of the ethos of the Global Programming Office. This doesn't quite get at your question, but I guess for broad, right, accountability. We do work very closely with and support civil society capacity building to do that kind of advocacy in those countries. So I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility to do that kind of programming.
And a lot of that is very USAID kind of governance focused, and they do a lot of that. We do all coordinate with them quite frequently, so some of that is actually dealt with on that level.
Yes.
Karen Riley from Hetty Ann Thiel. Usability is often an afterthought in the design of technologies that enable safe access to the open internet despite censorship and surveillance. What efforts exist to ensure that disabled activists have the same access to these tools, that these tools work with accessibility tools? Will there be funding so that all projects that create technology can hire usability engineers so that nothing about us without us is actually played out in our work?
Thank you. And again, this is more of a program question than a policy question, so I'll do my best, but I may actually need to look at some of my colleagues. I know that we do stress in our solicitations that there be access and that there be inclusion, basically, of disabled persons and their needs. That's about as detailed as I can get, but it's really more of a question for my colleagues on the program side.
And there actually was a project that actually did have a whole inclusive approach and make sure that there was accessibility. DRL just did a project on that, I think it was last year or year before. And so there is actually an effort out there to make sure that accessibility is built into the programs as well. So that project looked across the board at what areas persons with disability needed access and where they could build that in terms of the human rights portfolio and tools that were available.
Great.
Good morning, Alessandra Pinna, and I work with the Latin American team at Freedom House. From our perspective, obviously, the two countries that are concerning are Venezuela and Cuba, but beyond that, we are concerning in terms of violence against women in Central America, and especially we are concerned in terms of violence against transgender women in the Northern Triangle. Very often, violence comes from gangs, but also from police. So I would like to know what is your opinion on this and what is your main concern in terms of the Latin American region.
Do you want to take that one? So
I agree with you.
Yes, we work very closely with our Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, and we have several programs that focus in on making sure that we're empowering women organizations, making sure that we're training police officers to be able to address those issues, and so we partner very closely with them. Our focus has been thus far, not just in reporting, but training, but also being able to have services provided, so addressing and mapping where those services are available for women, but also from a diplomatic perspective, making sure that those women's issues and the violence against women are brought up quite frequently within the Northern Triangle. Additionally, there's a large focus programmatically that we just had last year go through our Western Hemisphere Affairs Office, put quite a large sum of money towards issues, which included gender issues, and that was built into much of that. Again, coming from an approach that's very holistic, a lot of it was also targeted towards women's economic empowerment and making sure that gender rights are included across the board. So again, looking at it from a very broad perspective, we're looking at partnerships and making sure that we build that in.
And I was just going to say, I didn't mean to grab that so strong. I was just going to say, too, that we have done some, as we wrestle for the mic, some labor violence programs in the Triangle area, too, right? And I used to cover Latin America and covered Venezuela, which, of course, is not part of the Triangle area. I think there's just a general overall violence challenge in that region, right, which you know if you cover the region. So a lot of times the way we get at it programmatically is through these different slivers of either gender or labor. But we have done definitely some, I'd say, substantial work in the Triangle area itself in labor violence.
So on LGBT, we have tried to incorporate into training for law enforcement and awareness of LGBT issues, and in particular the T issues. We've probably done the most work on that in Honduras.
And I would just note that we have global statements of interest out right now on LGBTI and intersectional issues that might address some of those issues.
Afrinatra from Madre. I have a couple of questions. One in terms of what are your priorities or plans in terms of funding or policy support for LGBT individuals in Iraq as they continue, as you know, they continue to face extreme risk. And the other thing is, as a member of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, we're seeing a very alarming trend of either downgrading or cutting of gender-related positions within several UN peacekeeping missions. So we were wondering if you had any engagement with the peacekeeping department on the issue. Thank you.
Yes, we have been engaging with the different international organizations and specifically addressing peacekeeping organization and pushing to make sure that gender inclusion is included, but not just those gender positions, but across the board training to make sure that the gender lens is actually applied towards peacekeeping missions and the feedback is coming in terms of what kind of data is coming in as well, so that those are evaluated in terms of what they're doing on the ground. So there's been a lot of engagement on that, but noted across the board funding is being cut left and right. So we recognize people have to make cuts, and we're hoping that the gender portfolios are not what is actually targeted. So certainly there is a strong effort to make sure that that is emphasized. And I would say the administration has been very supportive of making sure that gender is something that is a priority.
And in Iraq, we do make it a policy priority. Where did she go? There she is. We do make it a policy priority to discuss LGBTI issues with the government. It's a tough discussion, as you can imagine, and that's something that we'll keep doing. We'll stay on it.
Great.
Hi, I'm Brianna Eskridge with Help Age International. A colleague earlier asked about youth as a sort of area of focus. I'm also concerned about aging as an area of focus and older people. It seems like there's, global aging is becoming more of an issue that people are starting to pay attention to, but as a whole, there are usually a lot of calls that come out that focus on older people. So I'm wondering if that's a priority area or a focus that you're looking at.
In terms of gender issues, we've looked at making sure that, again, we're looking at the whole of women. So that includes gender-based violence in terms of aging, but not necessarily anything focused primarily at aging populations of women. But looking at pulling in women, making sure they're mentors, and bringing in just across the board the life cycle of what is happening for women, girls, and again, not capping out. But I think that also disability, addressing persons with disabilities would probably be an area that would come in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that we actually have a specific focus on people who are aging in my office as a policy priority. But we do have a focus on freedoms, fundamental freedoms, basically for everyone, which would include the aging population.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Cynthia Totten from Just Detention International. I'm wondering sexual abuse in the context of detention settings and by law enforcement and in other sort of similar settings like refugee settings, et cetera. How much of a concern is that? So sexual abuse against women, youth, children, et cetera.
From the gender perspective, it's absolutely something that we're not just looking for data on, but trying to look at best practices on providing services, making sure psychosocial support is built into all of our programs. So when we're looking on something that has to do with rehabilitation, reintegration, making sure that psychosocial support is built into that, not just for the beneficiaries, but for the implementers. You guys work on some really, really hard things. So we want to make sure that when you're dealing with very difficult issues, that is actually something that's also built into your programs. So across the board, absolutely, especially in areas of conflict. So when we're talking about women, peace, and security or countering violent extremism, these are areas where that particular concern and target and making sure that your budgets reflect that is very important. So yes, for us, it's absolutely a consideration and something that we hope is built into areas of conflict programming.
When it comes to sexual abuse by security forces, it's something we focus on. So we look at gross violations of human rights, and one of the big four is rape, especially rape under color of law, rape as a weapon of war. You mentioned sexual abuse in detention centers. What we need is reporting on it. Now, reporting on it, it's difficult for all the reasons that reporting on sexual abuse is difficult. But if it's in a detention center, if we can get the date, a named victim, and the detention center, then we know who's responsible, and we can make sure that that detention center is cut off. The other thing is, if you're talking about in conflict zones, same thing. What we're seeing more and more, what we're seeing, you probably know it better than we, is that this does get used as a weapon of war. And so if it's happening in a conflict zone again, the more details we can get, the better, because many times our embassies know if there is an allegation of sexual assault by security forces in a zone, we can figure out what unit of the security forces was deployed to that zone, and again, we can figure out who's responsible for it. So that's one of the four things that generally fall in the baskets of the types of abuses we look at. One is rape under color of law, rape as a weapon of war, extrajudicial killings, torture, and forced disappearances.
And I was just going to say, I had mentioned earlier that they have these long conversations at the ILO yearly, and that the one coming up next June is on gender-based violence. And right now there has been a collection, I think, of data from over 70 countries looking at things ranging from separate buses for women laborers in certain countries, so there's no harassment or anything worse than that. That is something certainly we're going to be on the lookout for, and there may be opportunities for our office to engage on it.
Quickly, too, that the Global Programming Office has a transitional justice and conflict prevention and accountability team, and the congressional earmark for those kinds of issues. So I encourage you to find our staff members who work on those issues specifically. We have about 5 minutes left, so if you could ask your questions succinctly, and we will try to answer them succinctly. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amanda Miller, and I'm representing Save the Children. My issue is, or my question rather, I'm curious about hearing about cross-thematic issues such as human trafficking, where at face value it can be something that is heavily focused on gender, where then it also involves law enforcement agencies and training up law enforcement organizations and ensuring that there are no violations of human rights on that front, and they can often cross international borders. So I'm curious to hear how DRL works together or in a cross-thematic regard. So do you all consult each other on your respective policies and focuses before you issue solicitations on these issues? Or also do you even cross departments, such as like BPRM will focus on trafficking and gender-based violence for refugees? So how does that collaboration process work?
So, we do have a trafficking in persons office, right, which typically does have an ambassador and probably will have one again. There are a lot of experts in that office, and obviously they also produce a report once a year, which I actually think probably still includes the Child Soldiers Protection Act list in that each year. We work closely with them, and as a matter of fact, when on my recent trip to Qatar and Bahrain last week, I was with a colleague from the TIP office, and we went to one of the shelters that has been set up in Qatar that was in response to this complaint against Qatar at the ILO. One of the things that was interesting was that, political will aside, certainly the establishment of that shelter, which my colleague in TIP said was of the highest quality, it seems like that was certainly produced and has been able to move forward bureaucratically because of the pressure of the TIP report and also the complaint against Qatar at the ILO. So that's not a full answer on exactly how we coordinate with them, because it's a big office and they've got a lot of expertise, but there's definitely overlap in working together and moving these issues forward.
There's only 2 minutes left, but just noting that the TIP office also has what they call a Senior Policy Operating Group, which is mandated coordination, so I love the law. And the other part is both DRL and GWE, we run interagency panels, so they all review and they're able to see programs that might overlap with other stakeholders, so that's something, and I used to work there, so I annoy them just like I annoy DRL.
Happens as well at the design phase when we're designing an notification of funding opportunity. So there is certainly internal DRL eyes on the concepts and feedback and input, and then across the department and across the U.S. government as well, where it is merited.
I should give our foreign assistance colleagues, our Office of Foreign Assistance colleagues credit too, because they also coordinate on the front end, making sure operational plans are all coordinated as well.
All right, we have 2 more questions. I don't know if we can fit them both in, but if they're very quick. Okay.
Hi, I'm Candace Bryan Abbey with the Lantos Foundation, and my question is for Lynn. Given the disbursement of internet freedom funds across so many different agencies and offices, can you talk about DRL's priorities for internet freedom funding, and can you also talk about whether or not there are any internal goals for projects that fund direct access?
So I can talk about what our policy priorities are. And our policy priorities are to maintain an open, interoperable, safe, secure environment for the internet, to promote freedom of expression, to promote freedom of association and assembly, and to do this through the variety of diplomatic tools that we have. For the programming part, I would refer you to my colleague Cyprian, who's here, to talk a little bit more about programming details.
I'm very sorry, sir, but we're going to have to cut it off because we only have 30 minutes for our next panel before lunch. So welcome you to come and chat with us on the margins. Want to thank all of our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and speak with us.
I want to thank GP for this opportunity and thank all of you for being here and the work that you do.
Great. Thank you very much.